Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Tonight, our program comes to you from the historic Charles Sumner School in downtown Washington. Our guests are Ambassador Akbar Ahmed and Dr. Bernard Lewis, and our topic, a special briefing on the Middle East and Islam. I am Heidi Shoup, President of the Council, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to introduce our speakers, who are internationally known scholars and experts on Islam. Speaking first will be Ambassador Akbar Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed holds the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University here in Washington. He is also the first Distinguished Chair of Middle East and Islamic Studies at the United States Naval Academy, Annapolis. Ambassador Ahmed was born in Allahabad and was educated at Birmingham University, Cambridge University, and received his PhD from the University of London. Widely acclaimed as the world's leading authority on contemporary Islam, his advice is sought by political and military leaders, and he is a regular commentator on the major media outlets. He has authored numerous award-winning books, including Journey into Islam, The Crisis of Globalization, which was the result of an unprecedented tour of the Muslim world, and most recently, Journey into America, The Challenge of Islam. Dr. Bernard Lewis is the Cleveland E. Dodge Professor Emeritus of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He is a widely acclaimed scholar and author of 29 books on the history of Islam and the interaction between Islam and the West. He received his BA and PhD degrees from the University of London. In 1949 until 1972, he was chair of the Department of History of Near and Middle East at the University of London, and in 1974 he moved to Princeton until his retirement in 1986. In 1990, the National Endowment for the Humanities selected Dr. Lewis for the Jefferson Lecture, the U.S. government's highest honor for achievement in the humanities. His most recent book, published this year, is Faith and Power: Religion and Politics in the Middle East. We are indeed honored and delighted to be able to host these distinguished speakers who hold differing views on various aspects of religion and politics in the Middle East, and so we can look forward to a thought-provoking and illuminative discussion this evening. Please join me in welcoming first Ambassador Akbar Ahmed and then Dr. Bernard Lewis.
Thank you, Heidi, for that very warm introduction. I do have one point I wish to object to. You cannot call me the world's leading Islamic scholar in the presence of Professor Bernard Lewis. I would like to thank the World Affairs Council, and I would like to thank you and my friend Josh for arranging this event and this very, very impressive audience this evening. I am honored and delighted to be on the stage with my distinguished colleague, Professor Bernard Lewis. We do go back. I first met him 3 decades ago, and we share Princeton and the School of Oriental and African Studies. We both study Muslim society and history, though we do have different, if overlapping, interests. Bernard is a historian, and I'm an anthropologist, which means I look at society, at ritual, at custom, at tradition. I look at societies on the basis of fieldwork. I traveled for 1 year with my young American researchers throughout the United States. I went to 75 cities, visited 100 mosques to study Muslims in America in the context of American society and history. We ended up with about 2,000 questionnaires, interviews, film footage on this journey. And we discovered many things about Muslims in America, that there are 3 kinds of Muslims in terms of categories: the mystics, those who believe in someone like Rumi, the modernists, most of them from the Middle East, South Asia, many African American Muslims, the doctors, the engineers who want to balance Islam with modernity their Islam identity with their American identity. And then there were the literalists, the Salafis, for example, who believed very much in adhering as closely to the text as possible. And these categories were visible in the three distinct ethnic categories of American Muslims: the African Americans, the immigrants, and the white converts. So again, you see how complicated and diverse Islam is in America, although we know that the media tends to depict Islam as a monolith. I was surprised to see the gap that had opened between Muslims and non-Muslims after 9/11 remained as wide as ever. Yet, Muslims seem to be very optimistic in America, full of vitality, and many told us that this is the best place in the world to be a Muslim. Many quoted Jefferson as one of their icons. And of course, we wrote it all up in the book, Journey into America. In the field, we also came across the power of Bernard Lewis's ideas, especially the notion that there is a global clash of civilizations between the West, between America and the world of Islam. Now, I do want to immediately point out that this is a simplification, a caricature of Professor Lewis's thesis, because he does in his book, What Went Wrong, take a much more nuanced position on studying the Muslim world. He points to the glories, the achievements of Islamic civilization 1,000 years ago, the contribution to arts and science and history and so on. And he laments the loss of fresh ideas, the role of women and so on, and the decline in some parts of the Muslim world, and advocates dialogue and understanding. Now, unfortunately, as the idea and the power of the clash of civilizations grew, both the phrase and the idea were picked up by Professor Huntington in his article, then book, and by the 1990s, this idea had become a global cliche, a concept, a controversy. And then came 9/11. And suddenly, an age had found a philosophy. The foreign policy of America seemed to have been working around the idea and implementation of the clash of civilizations. President Bush asked, "Why do they hate us?" Americans asked, "What is going on around us?" The media wanted to know, how do we explain the events around us after 9/11? And the answer was the clash of civilizations. It was simple, it was powerful, and it was a caricature of a very sophisticated interpretation of Muslim history. I heard, for example, Vice President Dick Cheney on television after the invasion of Iraq, pointing out how Muslims like to be ruled by brutal dictators, that how torture was so necessary for them. I saw this myself, and I can assure you as a Muslim, I do not want to be ruled by brutal dictators, and I do not like to be tortured by anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim. Now, as an anthropologist, what checks and why do Muslims react negatively to brutal dictators? In society, there are very powerful notions of dignity, of honor, of justice, adl, of the notion of equality before God. These are very powerful notions in Islamic society. And when given a chance, Muslims prefer democracy. The largest Muslim nation today, Indonesia, 240 million people, is a democracy. South Asia, Pakistan, Muslims in India, Bangladesh are democracies. There have been female prime ministers and presidents in these countries. Now, you may say these are not the most perfect of democracies, they're shaky democracies, but the democratic impulse is very strong in Muslim societies. But the unintended consequences, the vulgarization of the idea of the clash of civilizations, reduced us to facing these facts, and I want you to follow me here. One, the idea of a perpetual war between America and the Muslim world, until one triumphed in the end. This began to permeate society, and I asked myself, why is it necessary? Is it wise? Are we fighting 1.5 billion Muslims, 1/4 of the population, 57 nations, 7 million Muslims live here? Does it make any sense? Number two, it created a monolith of Muslims. We were fighting the Muslim world. We were fighting Muslim society. I've pointed out that this tiny Muslim minority in America, about 2 million, is not a monolith. Now think of the Muslim world. It is diverse in ethnicity, sect, and so on. Another consequence was the spread of a poisonous Islamophobia, so that all things Islamic were viewed negatively. A woman wearing a veil, a mosque. Again and again, these are being attacked even today, because there is now a sense of Islamophobia that permeates societies. I was attacked by a blogger, and Bernard will laugh at this. I was attacked because someone wrote saying he is the Ibn Khaldun chair, and they assumed that anyone with a name which sounded Arabic like Ibn Khaldun would be a terrorist. So they said he's named after Ibn Khaldun, who we know is a terrorist. Now, to a historian, Ibn Khaldun was called by Toynbee, his work was called the greatest work at any time by any individual at any period of history. And this person is being called a terrorist because that is the climate we are living in. The idea of the clash also created a sense of fear, anger, distrust in American society. We are living constantly in anticipation of the next terrorist move. And of course, on the news, we're hearing about these parcel bombs. In this atmosphere, think about it. What was sidelined and what was ignored were what are fundamentals to American society, to the understanding of America itself: human rights, civil liberties, the debate on torture, surveillance, and so on. The basic vision of the founding fathers. And from this environment grew another poisonous development, and that was the homegrown terrorist. And think about it, all these homegrown terrorists are post 9/11 phenomenon. They're Major Nidal or the 5 Virginians or Faisal Shahzad. They're coming out of this atmosphere. And almost a decade later, have we really achieved anything in this clash of civilizations? Are we any safer? 1 million lives later, 1 million lives, American lives, but also Iraqi lives, Afghan lives, millions displaced, trillions of dollars spent, trillions in debt, and the longest war in American history, the Afghan war. And we don't even know the collateral damage, quote unquote, that takes place. 30,000 Pakistanis killed in this war on terror by the Taliban and killing the Taliban. 30,000 Pakistanis since 9/11. And then we also need to remember that all this means that we ignore the real problems in the Muslim world. And until those problems are tackled by Muslim leaders and us as allies and friends of the Muslim world, nothing is going to be solved. Take a look at this. Too many military and civilian dictators in the Muslim world. The gap between the rich and the poor in the Muslim world grows wider and wider. The rates of illiteracy are shocking. And ilm or knowledge is so crucial in the Muslim world for Muslim consciousness. Bernard Lewis's entire thesis is based on the fact that 1,000 years ago Muslims contributed to civilization because of the drive towards ilm. Today we have lost that concept in the Muslim world. There's little justice. And above all, Muslims look around in despair. They see problems among the Palestinians, the Kashmiris, the Chechen, and they feel there is no justice in this world. Half century later, these people are still struggling for their rights. Another devastating consequence is creating a sense of contradiction and a conundrum in American foreign policy, at the heart of American foreign policy. On the one hand, you have the drive led by President Bush, President Obama, Secretary Clinton, General David Petraeus, to win the hearts and minds of the Muslim world. On the other hand, you have the need to defeat and humiliate the Muslim world. You cannot have such a sharp contradiction in foreign policy, and it creates a lot of confusion. Talk to an average Pakistani or an Afghan, and they'll say there are airstrikes, there are drone strikes. 98% of people who are killed are innocent women and children. 2% are supposed to be the targets. And yet, on the other hand, you have billions of dollars of aid being given to these countries. There is a confusion and consequently a high level of anti-Americanism. The controversy around Islam means that the demonization of Islam permeates all American society. And Bernard Lewis was careful to point out the achievements of Islam itself. And yet today, Islam in America has been reduced to a byword for terrorism or a worthless civilization or a community to be looked at with contempt, to the point that 20 to 25% of Americans actually believe that President Obama is a Muslim. And he now is so defensive that when he's on his visit to India, he refused to go to a Sikh temple because someone may think that that is a mosque and that he's secretly a Muslim. He actually refused to go to it. Now, I know we're all shocked because we know Sikhs and Muslims are not the same religion, but does it really matter in America? And at the same time, we look at the elections that are taking place just now. We've got the results coming in. How much of this is related to President Obama and his being a secret Muslim or not such a secret Muslim? Finally, I think the most important point is that the idea of the clash of civilizations, and if we are caught up in it, or rather the reduction to a caricature of the idea, deprives us of a solution, of alternatives. How are we to confront this world that we are living in the 21st century? I know from my field trip that there are vigorous interfaith movements taking place. I know that people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, are heroically reaching out to each other and are involved in building bridges. I know that that is the future. That is the future if we are able to live with dignity and honor between civilizations. There are many people here in this room. Imam Magid has just joined us. He heads the largest Islamic center in this whole area. They are very committed to this kind of interfaith activity. My own book has an entire chapter, the last chapter, which recommends various steps to be taken to promote understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims in America. The elections, of course, have shown us that there's a great deal of dissatisfaction in America, a great deal of frustration, and in a sense, the stage is set again for change. And here I will request my friend Professor Bernard Lewis that he has to, as an intellectual, as a historian, restore the idea that there is a clash, perhaps because we resemble each other too much, not because of our differences, but to move us to the alternative, which is an understanding, a dialogue of civilizations. And I would request him to help close this gap between Muslims and non-Muslims, and request my friend Heidi to prepare to celebrate Bernard's 100th birthday coming up in the next few years, so that when he comes to Washington, D.C. to the World Affairs Council, we have a large cake which should read, "Congratulations to the guru of the dialogue of civilizations." Thank you.
I'm struck dumb. However, I shall try to speak. Thank you for those very kind words. I need not tell you how very much they are appreciated. Before I get down to the points I had wished to make, I will quote one point which I think is very relevant and very important. It was a point which was made a long time ago in the 19th century by the Hungarian Jewish Orientalist Ignaz Goldziher. He made a point which I think is too often overlooked. He said, Islam should not be held responsible for the tribal customs of some of the peoples who embraced Islam. And he was referring in particular to two, female genital mutilation and honor killing. And neither of these is in any sense part of Islam. On the contrary, both are forbidden by Islam. And from early times, great efforts were made to prevent them. Nevertheless, they have persisted, they are widespread. In many countries, they are carried out, or should I say perpetrated, in the name of Islam, though there is no historical, legal, religious, or other justification for it. I repeat Goldziher's phrase, Islam should not be held responsible for the tribal customs of some of the peoples who embraced Islam. And that continues to the present day with other tribal customs which we are witnessing in various parts of the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world. I won't elaborate on that, at least not for the moment. Let me come now to my main theme. There are many religions in the world, but basically they fall into two types, which have been designated by their critics. I use in both cases the terms of abuse or condemnation as relativist and triumphalist. The term relativist was used to describe those religions which regard themselves as local or regional or tribal or whatever. The famous St. John of Capistrano, whose name still adorns the map of California, was a Franciscan father who was particularly obsessed with his hatred of Muslims and Jews, and devoted a great deal of his time and energy to campaigning against the two, organizing crusades for the one and pogroms for the other. He made many accusations against Jews, one of which, however, was fully justified. He said, the Jews hold this monstrous and absurd idea that everybody can be saved in his own religion. He's right, the Jews do maintain that. The Talmud says the righteous of all peoples have a place in paradise. That is, as I say, what is condemned as the relativist view. Now, where Muslims and Christians agree, I should say traditional Muslims and traditional Christians agree, is that that is quite wrong. Both share the perception that they are the fortunate recipients of God's final message to mankind, which it is their duty not to keep selfishly to themselves like the Jews, but to bring to the rest of humanity, removing whatever obstacles there may be in the way, by whatever amount of force may be needed. And where you have two religions side by side, with the same religious view, with the same self-perception, conflict between them is inevitable. And that's why we have this ongoing clash for the last 14 centuries. Jihad and crusade and their various equivalents, arising not, as I said, from their differences, but most acutely from their resemblances. I'll come back to that point in a few moments. A great deal is said nowadays about the problem of terrorism. As I mentioned a moment ago, terrorism is not Islamic. On the contrary, it is expressly condemned by Islam. Islam, as you know, is a religion of law. One of the major differences between Islam and Christianity is that the founder of Christianity was put to death, and his followers were a persecuted minority for the formative centuries of their religion. And an institution arose called the Church, which developed its own rules and traditions and laws. Islam triumphed during the lifetime of its founder. He was not put to death. On the contrary, he created a state and a society which in time became an empire. He enforced and applied as well as promulgated laws. And he therefore had to deal in a way which the early Christians did not have to deal, with all sorts of practical, immediate, everyday problems, for which, therefore, there is guidance, shall we say, authoritative guidance for Muslims in the founding documents of their faith. And these are very clear on certain points, one of which, a very important one, is tolerance. La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. Certain things are not permitted. Polytheism is not permitted. But within certain limits, Islam from the very beginning lays down a certain measure of admittedly limited conditional tolerance, but nevertheless much better than was available anywhere in the Western world for many centuries. If you look for comparison is often made between the confrontation between the Ottoman Empire, the last of the great Muslim powers in the 16th and 17th centuries, and Christian Europe, between that and the confrontation between the West and the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And it's true, there are many resemblances between them. I think it's significant that the movement of refugees, of those who, in Lenin's phrase, voted with their feet, was overwhelmingly from the Christian lands to the Islamic lands. In the Islamic lands, there was tolerance available for non-Muslims, even for deviant Muslims up to a certain point. Unfortunately, movements have since arisen within the Islamic world which deny some of the very foundations of their own faith. And that is one of the problems we have to confront at the present time. And when I say we, I mean all of us, including the Muslims, indeed, more especially the Muslims, because it is a problem which arises from within their community, and of which they themselves are the most immediate and most profound victims. Now, the effects of modernization in the Islamic world, as elsewhere, have brought many significant changes. Changes in perception, changes in attitude, and of course, changes in reality. We in the Western world tend to assume that modernization always means improvement. This is not true. It works in different ways. And one of the tragedies of the Muslim world is that the process of modernization, particularly during the 19th and early 20th centuries, brought disastrous negative changes. Let me give you an example. In the 1780s, not long before the French Revolution, we have a fascinating letter from the French ambassador in Istanbul, the ambassador, that is to say, sent by the King of France to the Ottoman Sultan. His government were complaining that he wasn't making very rapid progress with his instructions, with the negotiations he had been ordered to carry on with the Ottoman government. And the French ambassador in 1780-something, writing to Paris, says, here, meaning here in Istanbul, he says, here it is not as in France, where the king is sole master and does as he pleases. Here, he says, the Sultan has to consult. He has to consult with all kinds of people, with the holders of high office, even with retired former holders of high office, with the bazaar merchants, with the religious establishment, and so on and so on. Ambassador was making a profoundly important point. To say that Islam, classical Islam, was a democracy is either meaningless or absurd, depending on how you use the word democracy. Every generation, every society redefines the word democracy to suit its own purposes. Remember, when Germany was divided, it was the communist dictatorship that called itself the German Democratic Republic. So don't attach too much importance to the use of the word democracy. The important word is consultative. Traditional Islam lays great stress on the need for consultation. And this was indeed the fact. There were powerful interests within the Muslim society, traditional and recognized, with which governors had to deal. Consultation is a very basic principle of Islam from the beginning. Shawirhum fil amri. Consult them in matters. The tragedy of modernization was that it put an end to that. The effect of modernization was enormously to increase the strength of the central government, while weakening or removing those intermediate powers which in the traditional Islamic society had acted as constraints and limitations on the power of the government. They were gradually reduced or eliminated. Adolphus Slade, a British naval officer who spent some time in 19th century Turkey and wrote some remarkably good books, made this point very clearly. He talked about how the old nobility, the old bazaar merchants, the old landowners and others all acted in their various ways. And then he went on to say, speaking of what he calls the new nobility that has emerged through modernization, he said, the state is the estate of the new nobility. Created a new class of people for whom the state was their estate. This is not traditional Islam, this is modernized Islam. And I think it's a very important point to bear in mind in assessing the historical role of Islam, the historical background. Now, where does that leave us at the present time? were referred to the clash of civilizations. Certainly this is an important element. I mentioned before two kinds of religions in the world, the relativistic, accepting the position that there are different religions, each for itself. There are two religions which do not accept that view, who feel that they are the fortunate recipients of God's final message, the Christians and the Muslims. And where you have two religions with the same self-perception, the same sense of vision, confronting each other side by side, the clash becomes inevitable. And that clash has been going on for a long time. There are signs that we may be drawing to an end. There are beginnings of dialogue. We see this in a number of places, most strikingly in the beginnings of dialogue between the previously mutually exclusive triumphalist religions. And I think in that dialogue, in that, let's call it that, relativism, lies our best hope for the future. The best hope of mutual respect and mutual understanding. Thank you.
Bernard, you raised some, I believe, really important issues. One of them, when I hear you, I'm startled because I very often watch the media. I'm an anthropologist to understand what's being said and how people are looking at Islam. And the notion that honor killing is not Islamic, honor killings, genital mutilation is not Islamic, Islam does not promote terrorism, Islam promotes tolerance. These go against the grain of so much thinking, so much, I would say, reductionist interpretations of Islam that today instinctively people associate these very concepts with Islam. So the question is, you as a scholar, based on your years of scholarship, are saying, making this statement, I want to ask you, how can we get this message, this interpretation, this scholarship to be heard in mainstream American media so that this very distorted understanding of Islam is corrected?
Well, it's not really mainstream American media, it's the Muslims themselves that we have to persuade. I mean, take the example of honor killing. Honor killing is expressly denounced and forbidden by Islam. It was already a problem in the time of the Prophet, and the Prophet made elaborate arrangements to prevent it. I mean, for example, an accusation of adultery requires 4 adult male witnesses. It would be a singularly incompetent adulterer who would commit his sin with that kind of audience. The Prophet himself tried very hard to legislate, to provide institutional restraints to prevent honor killing, which was already then a deeply rooted Arab tribal custom. But it did not succeed. It survived among the Arabs and spread from there to other parts of the Muslim world. This is a very old problem, and it goes back to the very roots of Islam. And yes, I think it's a problem, first of all, which the Muslims have to resolve. But I think it's a problem of which they have been aware for a very long time.
It's, as you said, the tension within Muslim society between a tribal interpretation of Islam and a textual understanding of Islam. So you have this tension throughout the Muslim world, even today. So honor killings which take place in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and Afghanistan, Pakistan still remain a fact of life, although they're denied by Islam itself. And then, of course, as you say correctly,
they're not just denied, they are prohibited.
Prohibited, yes. And they're picked up then as stories, and of course the world assumes that this is sanctioned by Islam itself. So it's a double challenge, really. So what is the best way forward then, Bernard?
I'm a historian. My business is the past. I don't usually deal with the future. On the contrary, I try to avoid having to deal with it. But from time to time, we have to look at it and confront it and decide what, if anything, we can do. It seems to me that the world today, we face many dangers. The present moment, this one with which we are generally most occupied, is the so-called clash of civilizations between, in our paper it says the Middle East and the West. I think more accurately it could be called between the Islamic world and, shall we say, the post-Christian world. Remember that the Islamic world is now in the early 15th century. Just think of where Christendom was in the 1430s. Just heading for the great struggles of the Reformation, the great religious wars in Germany and elsewhere, long and bitter struggles within the Christian world. Islam is at that phase now. So there are obviously serious problems within Islam, as well as problems between Islam and the rest. But fortunately, we can move much more rapidly nowadays thanks to modern communication. And thanks to one advantage that the Muslim world has, which the Christian world did not have in the past and does not have at the present time, and that is a strong historic awareness. The level of knowledge of history among Muslims generally in the Muslim world is astonishingly high. I was first struck by this during the Iraq-Iran war, when I made a study of the war propaganda of both sides. Propaganda addressed by the Iraqi and Iranian governments to their own people and, of course, to their enemies. Propaganda full of historical allusions. And I mean allusions, not stories from the past, but quick passing references to the past. Allusions which were made in the sure knowledge that they would immediately be picked up and understood by the target audience. I mean, in this country, even the first Bush administration is ancient history. And as far as World War II is concerned, I mean, that's archaeology. The general lack of awareness of the past, not to speak of factual knowledge of the past, is staggering. The Muslim world is very, very different in this respect. There is a very strong sense of history. The history is not by any means always very accurate, that's something else. But the sense of awareness, and awareness of history is very important. And that, I think, is an important factor at the present time. Because we see the awareness that the long ongoing struggle, which continued for so many centuries, between the two rival claimants to the same role, that's to say the role of being the final recipients of God's final message, that is no longer the main issue. That it's time for the two to get together and to confront other greater dangers. And we see signs of that already. There are the beginnings of dialogue, even at the most religious level. And following that, of a willingness to confront these other greater dangers. And I think that is a very hopeful sign at the present time.
I think I agree, Bernard, that perhaps the most hopeful sign in the last decade or two, and I've been privileged to be involved in this, is the lead taken by some extraordinary religious leaders towards dialogue. In Washington, I may mention Senior Rabbi Bruce Lustig of the Washington Hebrew congregation, Bishop John Chain, who after 9/11 formed the first Abraham Summit, and I know Imam Magid is very much part of it. In England, in your old country, you have the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chief Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, very prominent both locally and internationally in promoting dialogue. And you have a counterpart impulse in the Muslim world to also be involved in this dialogue. So this, I think, is a very hopeful sign. Of course, the challenge is for this dialogue to really be taken to mainstream the public, both here in America and in the Muslim world, to mainstream society. And that's the challenge, rather than just an elite dialogue of the people who agree with each other, the like-minded. That is the challenge.
I would put it this way. The moment the dialogue or confrontation is still going on between these two forces which have been in conflict for so long a period, which we may define as Islam and the West, or Islam and Christendom, or Islam and post-Christendom, or the Middle East and the United States, they all mean the same thing. If that conflict can be brought to an end, if they can find a way of meeting and communicating and reaching some sort of agreement and compromise, then there is hope for the future. If not, and this is certainly a very serious possibility, if this struggle continues, then they will destroy each other and leave the future either to be shared or disputed between India and China.
It is a somber thought, and I hope this distinguished audience, if nothing else, takes this thought away, that the Abrahamic faiths really are one half of the world's planet in terms of population. And right now they are locked in this kind of confrontation. Sometimes it's a hot confrontation, sometimes it's tension, but there is a simmering confrontation taking place. And I agree with Bernard that they may end up in simply, if not destroying each other, certainly negating each other. And other superpowers will take over, because nature abhors a vacuum, and that is the nature of society in which we live. So it is a thought that we need to take away and begin to work towards promoting the dialogue of civilizations.
Why do you believe so many individuals fail to recognize the contributions of the Muslims to the West and vice versa?
As I mentioned before, the lack of interest, the lack of awareness, and therefore the lack of knowledge of the historic past is breathtaking. In the Islamic world, we have a different problem. It's not no history, but wrong history. It's a sort of tendentious, slanted history, which is perhaps even more dangerous. I think we have to overcome both of those before we can make any progress on this point.
Why aren't moderate and the majority of Muslims speaking out against radical extremists? They outnumber the extremists by millions and could be so powerful.
The answer is, not only are they speaking out, not only are they involved in a verbal confrontation with the extremists in their own society, but they are involved in a physical battle for Islam within Muslim society. If you don't believe me, let me give you some live examples. Benazir Bhutto, whatever her politics, good or bad, represented what you call moderate Islam. She represented a modern democracy. She wished to bring a modern enlightenment to Islam. She knew her life was in danger, yet she went back to Pakistan and willingly and gave her life for democracy. So when I hear this, where are the moderate Muslims, I'm just appalled at the ignorance of the person asking that question, because it's 10 years since 9/11 and this question is still asked. When she died, elections were held in Pakistan. And Pakistan, incidentally, is 180-85 million people. It's nuclear, so it's not just a marginal country. And for America today, it is a key ally. And her party swept into office. Now, her party is opposed by the fundamentalist extremists and so on. Those are the moderates battling it out right now. My wife's cousin, my wife is here, Zeenat, 6 of her first cousins died in Swat, up in the North Pakistan, battling the Taliban. They were actually killed by them in the physical battle to rid the land of those extremists and the men of violence. Muslims are not only talking about taking back Islam from the extremists, but are sacrificing lives and resources in that battle. So please don't underestimate the sacrifices of the moderates. They're very much out there, and they're battling because they know this. It's not a battle because they are fighting it for America or the West. They're fighting it for their own homes, their own future, their own religion. What complicates things, unfortunately, is that very often this perception from the West that all Muslims are a monolith, so the moderates and the extremists and the mystics, they're all jumbled up into this monolithic image of one Islam. That is not the case. I'm giving you examples of people actually dying in the battle to preserve Islam, mainstream Islam.
Okay, now here's a question from one of the student groups here tonight, from the International Affairs Society at George Washington University. The media, specifically the American media, some would argue, has only increased the gap or the clash of civilizations. How is this to be corrected, and what role does education of the youth play?
Yes, I agree that the media is not evil or negative per se.
No.
Media is just technology. It can be a great force
Exactly.
for understanding and great force for bridge building, and can be a great force for a negative understanding of any particular community and religion. And for the young, what encourages me so much is that the young are curious, the young Americans. And you mentioned the George Washington students. I've got my American University students here. These are the people who inspire me. These are the people who are going to be leaders tomorrow. And they're not accepting a lot of what they see and hear. They're thinking for themselves. For me, I see a lot of the media. I very often get frustrated at the interpretation of Islam. I ask myself, where are the scholars? Why aren't the scholars on television? I don't see much of Bernard Lewis or Professor Lawrence Rosen, who's another scholar of Islam at Princeton University, Professor Tamara Son. I could go on and on and on. And yet the instant experts are telling me about Islam, and they are the experts because they know how to handle the media. 30-second sound bites, 50-second sound bites. And tomorrow they'll be giving commentary on Japan or water on the moon or Mars or some completely different subject. And yet a professor or scholar who spent a lifetime studying the subject may not be consulted.
Apropos of the role of the media, I am reminded of a famous saying, I think it was by H. Mencken. He said, for every one of the problems of the world, there is an answer. Simple, clear, and wrong.
Okay, this is a question, there are a couple of very similar questions here about Iran. Is there any possibility of better relations between the United States and Iran anytime soon? And if there is, what can or should the United States do to promote these better relations? And then the other question also includes the Iranian attempt to build the bomb, or the reported Iranian attempt to build the bomb. So,
The Iran question is a very complex one, and there are a number of different aspects which have to be considered. I think the first point which one has to bear in mind is that Iran is a real nation, nation, in the sense in which we use those terms in the Western world. If you look at the map of the Middle East, west of Iran, almost all of them are modern creations, modern inventions, mostly with frontiers drawn with rulers on maps, straight lines, by European diplomats and colonial officials. Iran is a real country, and in Iran you have not nationalism but patriotism, as we use that term in the Western world. Now, why do I make this point? Because I think it's very important, however angry we may get with the actions and policies of the Iranian regime, that we should not give that regime a gift of something that they do not at present enjoy, and that is the support of Iranian patriotism. Now, you have to be careful what you say. If you're saying Iran must not have nuclear weapons, try to look at this from the point of view of an Iranian patriot, not necessarily a supporter of the regime. You say to the north, we have a nuclear-armed Russia. To the south, a nuclear-armed India and Pakistan. To the east, a nuclear-armed China. To the west, a nuclear-armed Israel. Who is to tell us that we must not have nuclear weapons? Look at it from the perspective, as I said, of an Iranian patriot, not necessarily a supporter of the regime. And I think it makes sense. I think in making that point, we must be very careful to say that what we don't want is nuclear weapons in the hands of this murderous regime. Not Iran must not have, but these tyrants and murderers must not have. It is not at all the same thing. Now that brings me to the further question of how to set about this. Well, as I said a moment ago, thanks to the wonders of modern communication, it is possible to be in touch with Iran, with people in Iran all the time now. You can do it by telephone, you can do it by email, you can do it in a number of ways. And we are astonishingly well informed nowadays about movements of opinion within the Iranian world, within the internal Iranian world, reactions to what's going on and so on. For example, when the American forces went into Iraq, there was a joke that was common in Iran at the time, which came out on various lines of communication. You should have tackled your problems in alphabetical order. First Iran, then Iraq. When the American planes were flying over Afghanistan, the story was that many Iranians put signs on their roof saying, "This way, please." And so on and so on. A lot of others of the same kind. But as I said, we must do this in agreement with the Iranian opposition. Now, there are two oppositions in Iran. There is the opposition within the regime, and there is the opposition to the regime. Both are important, both are powerful, and my own feeling is that the regime is not going to last very much longer, that it is possible with some effort to bring about political change in Iran. The way to do this is not what the late John Kelly aptly called the diplomacy of the preemptive cringe. For example, reaching out to Iran does not mean trying to make nice to the regime. When our present president spoke out, the response from the regime in Iran, which I heard from various friends, was in Persian, "He is with us, Obama. Maba'o, and we are with him." And that's not the way to do it. There are ways nowadays of communicating with the opposition, or oppositions, I should say, of helping them, and so on. And the opposition in Iran now is very powerful and very active. One hears things all the time. Ahmadinejad, for example, president, a very important figure, is apparently extremely unpopular. And there are many ways in which, as I said, one can help the opposition.
Any country promotes its foreign policy on the basis of its self-interest. America cannot afford to lose an important country like Iran permanently. We must remember that only a few decades ago, Iran was the closest ally of the United States of America. All right, changed circumstances, new regime in power, but we cannot afford to lose the nation. Bernard has pointed out to the sense of fierce pride and nationalism. I want to underline this sense of patriotism. I want to underline the pride, the national pride, the sense of dignity among Persians and Iranians. And it is rooted in a sense of history that Iranians carry with them. This is a civilization that has ruled not only that region, but has vast influence to the west, north, east. So that even today, the Persian language, for example, has influenced several languages in the region. So Persian poets like Rumi, who wrote in Persian, are understood and quoted and loved throughout the region. So we need to remember that there are problems with the regime, but we must not lose that entire nation, that entire civilization. Because if America is to be realistic and imagine that there's going to be a time, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, when it needs to have a strong presence in the region, in Iraq, in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, it needs Iran either neutralized or on its side. But it cannot continue to simply be on this confrontationist path, which involves the entire nation of Iran. As Bernard has pointed out, there's a great deal of opposition to the present regime as it is, but the moment we start attacking Iran as a body, as a nation, they all join up and team up, because then it is seen as an attack on the Iranian people themselves, exactly as the attacks on Islam. So that rather than identifying the terrorists or the men of extreme, we say Islam is bad. And that, of course, unifies all Muslims, whether they're mystics or modernists or literals. So we need to be much more nuanced in our dealing with a nation and society that are famous for being nuanced in their understanding of the world. This has been a major power, and from our understanding of Greek history, we know that they've played a role in history. an imperial role. They've expanded, they've contracted, but they have been there and they will remain there as a major player in the region. And if we have our interests in Iraq, as we do, and in Afghanistan, as we do, and in Pakistan, as we do, it is good to remember that these three countries have hundreds of miles of border with Iran. And there are tribes and peoples that straddle these countries. So the same tribes living in Iran and in Iraq, in Afghanistan and in Iran, Pakistan and in Iran. The Baloch tribes, for example, in Pakistan, they live on the Pakistan side of the border and the Iran side of the border.
Okay, I think Professor Lewis, you touched on this just briefly. The question is, what form would an Islamic Reformation take? How would it look, and what would Islam look like after that Reformation?
It's a question which is often asked, and to be quite honest, I feel that the question is meaningless. I mean, Reformation is a Christian term, it's part of Christian history. And it's basically a revolt against ecclesiastical authority. In Islam, there's no such thing as ecclesiastical authority. The entire question and the entire solution, therefore, it seems to me, are irrelevant. Islam has other problems, other concerns, but a reformation in the sense in which that term is used in Christian history seems to me irrelevant. Would you agree?
I completely agree. And in fact, again, I'm very often asked this, when is your Reformation coming? And I try to give an answer like Bernard said. It is a concept, a critical concept in Christianity. You cannot simply take a concept, a term from one religion and impose it on another. Islam needs a vigorous renaissance. It needs a vigorous reinstallment of ideas of justice, of knowledge. And there I am the strongest advocate in my own very little way of promoting what made Islam what Islam was in terms of history. The promotion of knowledge, for example. The fact that ilm, the word for knowledge, is the second most used word in the Quran after the name of God. That is how important ilm is in Islam. And yet you look at the Muslim world today and you look at the figures, the statistics for education, and they are appalling. Any Muslim with any conscience would feel embarrassed and appalled. And look at the elite. It's not that there's no money, there's no resources. The elite have untold wealth. And what is happening to that wealth? In the last half century, where has that wealth gone? Where are the great universities? Where are the great scholars? Where are the new ideas? It's very, very, very poor in terms of the resources and population the Muslim world has. So it isn't a question of reformation, it's a question of renaissance, recreating something that has been lost in the Muslim world today.
Thank you both, and please join me in thanking them.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.